One day, a bunch of us were in one of the offices. Paul Lazarsfeld bustled into the room, looked around, and said, "Okay, we can come in here. There's nobody here." Nobody here was 4 or 5 of us women working, doing coding, making tables and taking percentages and things like that. Nobody's here. And that's how we were. We were nobody. It was exciting. It was like getting behind the scenes of a Hollywood movie.
Television was really new at this point. That was a very exciting thing that was going to happen.
I wanted to know everything there was to know.
But you had to have a master's degree, so I couldn't qualify for that.
Whoever wanted to get some cheap survey done came to the Bureau, and I got stuck with it.
There were absolute jerks getting ahead, and we were being left behind.
Nobody wanted us.
The history of communications research in America began in the decades following World War I, with the explosion of propaganda and mass marketing and the invention of radio broadcasting and the talkies. Men dominated media production, writing and publishing the tabloids and directing and producing the radio programs and commercials. Sociologists such as Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton laid down the foundations of media theory in publications such as Radio Research, Mass Persuasion, and Personal Influence. Women were the audience, the ones who bought the tabloids and tuned into the soaps, and whose time and talents were taken up primarily within the domestic sphere. Pearl Harbor changed all that. With the men overseas, women streamed into the factories, the printing presses, and the broadcast studios, producing both the munitions and the media that served the war effort. And for the first time, women entered the research institutions whose mandate it was to analyze and decode media power and effects. Without fanfare, and often without credit, these women helped establish the fields of communications and media research that we know today. This is the story of 5 of those women.
I am a New Yorker, born and bred in Manhattan, a member of a upwardly mobile Jewish family. I started out in a little tiny private school on Riverside Drive, and that was fun because it was like a one-room schoolhouse. Everybody was in the same room. All the grade levels were in the same room. And I used to tune in to what was going on with the upper classes. I wanted to learn everything there was to know in every book ever written.
I was born in 1921 in Lower Manhattan. I think it was the St. Mark's Hospital. My father was a pharmacist, and my mother was a housewife. Dad came here from Poland when he was 8 years old, the oldest of, I think, 6 children. And Mother came here in her late teens, and I might add that she found it sort of shocking to be on the Lower East Side, walking along the street one day and having a corset sail out of the window and land on her head.
I was born in Greenwich Village. My parents were musicians. My mother, a cellist, my father, a violinist. My father provided orchestras for movie houses. This was before the talking machines, as he called them. They used to go occasionally to see free movies because my father had an orchestra in that particular movie.
Well, growing up in Rochester was ideal. I lived a block away from the University of Rochester's women's campus. And that was my playground, was the women's campus of the University of Rochester. I learned to roller skate, I learned to bicycle, I learned to avoid men asking funny questions. The neighbors knew you. So it was a very guarded and happy childhood. When I was young, it was my job in the morning to go downstairs, open the front door, run out on the porch, get the paper, take it upstairs and give it to my father. Said thank you. Every morning I did that. And one morning I ran downstairs, opened the front door, went out on the porch, got the paper, and I knew I could read. I was just flabbergasted. I knew all that day that I could read and that my life was turning into something really quite interesting.
I grew up in a city that doesn't really exist any longer, and I always believed that Atlantic City was an absolutely wonderful place to grow up in. My parents had come from Philadelphia. It was a working class background. Neither my father nor mother had graduated from high school, but they were both very bright people. They were both very interested in education, and I thought I had a very happy childhood, although we had no money, and then when the Depression hit, it was really rough. It was rough for everybody, but I think in Atlantic City it was even rougher because they really had no real economic base other than tourism. And so therefore the city was absolutely dead during the Depression.
Growing up in the Depression left its mark on everybody who lived through it. Things were tight financially in our household. My mother's sister and brothers would periodically come and live with us, and my father and mother never turned anybody away, so there were a lot of tight corners for them to handle. And I know my father was always pawning things and trying to get them back. It was tight, it was tough.
Well, we weren't hardest hit. My father did have the drugstore. We did own our house. But money was very scarce, and we had to be very, very careful about it. If one walked along the street and found a penny on the sidewalk, would you believe it, one picked it up?
I lived near a park, which was full of men sleeping on benches at night. The Depression was very visible. I mean, husbands were leaving, and there was a lot of suicide. And I think that this whole environment had a tremendous impact on my generation. Tremendous. On the one hand, we were very anxious to achieve, but on the other hand, very worried that the opportunities for achievement weren't going to be there. So there was this kind of ambivalence, but all of us thought a lot about what we wanted to do. I thought I'd be a journalist for a while, and I took a course in journalism, and they sent me out to cover Sunday morning sermons. And that was deadly. I came back and said, that's out. I'm not going to be a journalist. And I did drop that as quickly as I could. But I was interested. I was interested in newspapers and read them. And on Sundays, we used to get the Hearst papers, which were full of terrible stories. And there were arguments between my parents about whether I should be allowed to read these tabloid papers or not, but I read them.
My first idea of what I wanted to do was I decided in a day when women did not become lawyers that I was going to be a lawyer. I saw a movie, a silent movie obviously, and I believed that Norma Shearer was the one who played a lawyer, a woman lawyer. And that was what really basically, that was what gave me the idea that I would like to be a lawyer. And I wanted to be a lawyer until I actually went to Michigan, when I changed my mind and fell in love with sociology.
World War II was fought on many fronts, one of them through propaganda. The Office of War Information and the Voice of America produced material for both domestic and overseas audiences, disseminated through radio, motion pictures, and print.
I was always interested in writing. I was bilingual. And lo and behold, for 5.5, almost 6 years, I worked with Italian refugees and the Voice of America, writing broadcasts to partisan units behind enemy lines in Italy. I literally did not speak English during that period. Constant interaction with these refugees. And the refugees were, most of them were Italian Jews who, from the north. Most of them hardly knew that they were Jewish. And as they explained it to me, they said we were graduate students, and all of a sudden the dean called us and said, Signor Levi, lei non può rimanere qui. And they say, what? I can't attend these courses? No, lei è ebreo, you're a Jew. A large part of what I did was in answer to intelligence reports. For today, we would find out that 45 people had been shot in the morning for accused of collaboration with the Allies, that sort of thing. And then immediately I would write a broadcast, which is an answer to what we heard broadcast on the broadcast units.
But at the time, very little was known about how these media influenced their audiences. And so the OWI and the VOA turned to academics and research institutions for guidance, in particular, the Bureau of Applied Social Research at Columbia University. The Bureau had been founded as the Office of Radio Research in 1937. Paul Lazarsfeld, a European émigré and director of the Bureau, enlisted dozens of women as foot soldiers in the search for insights into the new science of media effects.
My father was in advertising, and that's how I started working, because when I was in college, on the vacation periods, because of my father's connections, I would get little jobs at advertising agencies, coding and doing silly things like that. And when I graduated, that was in '43 of June, I didn't have any firm ideas of what I was going to do, but I wanted to get a job. I decided I would go up to Columbia and see Bob Lind. Robert S. Lind was the man who wrote Middletown, and he was the only name I knew in sociology. So I went up to Columbia one hot summer day, into Fairweather Hall, and there was nobody in the building, and I was looking around and, didn't know where to go. And then there was a figure coming down from the upper floor, very good-looking young man in a tweed jacket and, leather patches on his sleeves, the typical professor. And he said, coming down the stairs, he saw me there, he said, "Can I help you?" or anything. And I looked at him, and he looked like a graduate student, and I said, "You? Help me?" And then we started talking. And that was the day that Bob Merton hired me to work on the Kate Smith study. That was my first venture in research at Columbia.
The popular singer Kate Smith led a wildly successful bond drive that captured the hearts and wallets of millions of American citizens, who pledged almost $40 million in aid of the troops overseas.
When I graduated in June of 1941, the financial world was not great. And one could get a job at Macy's as a sales girl, which was I think they earned as much as $5 a week is my memory, but you had to have a master's degree, so I couldn't qualify for that. I went to they called it a business school. It was a secretarial school, and learned shorthand and typing. And at one point, I was urged to take a crack at Columbia to work with Paul Lazarsfeld. Well, there were all kinds of projects that we worked on. I remember there was an episode when there were studies being done for True Story. They provided bread and butter, but it was a way of studying media behavior.
We did an analysis, a content analysis. That was new, too, at that time. I was very good at this sort of stuff. Content analysis of short stories in colleges and the popular magazines, weekly, Saturday Evening Post and stuff. And we analyzed the characteristics of the heroes and the villains. The villains were always Italian. And the heroes were upright Anglo-Saxon. It was so what we wouldn't allow now, but that's what was there.
I do remember working on a Superman study, and all I can remember about that is that Bob Merton and a number of the graduate students, and we all sat around brainstorming what it was we could study about what Superman was meaning. It was new, you see, at the time, what it meant to the children. But then I was sent to Decatur, Illinois. The Decatur study was about personal influence. We were studying how people formed opinion in several areas, in politics, in entertainment, I think movies, so that we were looking for how opinions were formed and what the personal influence line was. It was great fun working on that project. We were away from the nest. We were on our own in Decatur, Illinois, which was pretty far from New York. And it was fun. It was exciting. I think we all felt we were being innovative in social research. And it was very exciting to try things out, to see how they worked. And personally, I think we all liked one another. The last of the panel study interviews that we did was just before the election, and this was 48. And so, of course, we secretly that evening at home tabbed through everything to see, was it true that Dewey was going to be elected, which everybody assumed was so. Not so in our sample. And so we said, all right, we're not in the business of predicting who's going to win. We're just doing a study of how people decide what to do. And I think we kept our mouths shut because our sample was voting for Truman. And as you may all know, perhaps not, it was Truman that was elected, and the newspapers that had been printed with the Dewey headline had to be trashed. So that was sort of fun.
The Bureau was a very interesting place because Paul Lazarsfeld was doing everything he could to help refugees. And there are a number of people who worked at the Bureau who were European refugees. And they were fascinating people. And then there were the rest of us, graduate students, who thought we should be running the place and doing any kind of research. That was, I didn't pass judgment on it. But some of it was very challenging and some of it wasn't. Now, in general, women did a lot of the dumb jobs. interviewing, coding, calculating, doing, nothing very interesting, but enough to keep you interested. And Paul, I think, tried very hard to balance the Columbia University atmosphere and the Bureau, which was a business really, and getting people to feel the same commitment that they might have felt to a classroom. So it was a very busy place, and yet you might walk in and not see very much because people were out interviewing, or people were over in a corner doing coding or doing something else. There was usually a coffee break during the day when everybody would pull together and have some very sophisticated ideas to throw out. Women like to talk, and much of the interviewing I did was daytime interviewing, so I'd be interviewing housewives. And I found their lives very interesting. I still enjoy talking to people, and I enjoyed that kind of listening.
The interviews were what we called, or came to call, depth interviews. They were probing for the underlying motivations in terms of what accounted for the behavior that they were reporting. And we called it an interview guide, where you had a general area that you wanted to explore, and then the interviewer sort of freelanced it. There weren't questions like yes, no, and maybe. It required reporting feelings and experiences. So that was something that hadn't been done before, or at least as far as I know, hadn't been, because mostly they were using survey-type questions and answers with check boxes. And the interesting part for me in all this was that it took me into a world I didn't know at all. We got the names of the people who responded to Kate Smith's appeal to buy war bonds, and then we tracked them down and went and talked to them to find out what motivated them, how did they come to succumb to her appeal. And it got me into homes that I never would have gotten into, places in the Bronx, in Brooklyn. I was in Brooklyn at one point, tracking down a respondent, and I got lost. I didn't know where I was. So I knocked on the door, and I said to the person who came to the door, "Where's the bus?" And the answer I got was, "The boss, he's upstairs asleep." I mean, it was a different language. It was a whole other world. And so I got into these homes and I met people and talked to them for hours. And they opened. They just talked. It was exciting. It was like getting behind the scenes of a Hollywood movie. And the idea was you probed, quote unquote. If somebody said something that sort of needed a little more explanation, you would follow it up with, "What do you mean, and why did you say that?" and so forth. And nobody had done interviews like this before. And Merton got the credit for all that.
At that time, it was perfectly possible to do personal interviews at home, and by and large, people were very receptive. There was one incident, I don't remember whether it was in Elmira, it must have been in Elmira, New York, in the voting study. I remember young Roger Baldwin going out to interview and kept going back to the same house to get the same respondent, because it too was a panel study. And nobody would answer the door, and he finally succeeded by yelling out, "I see you, you're wearing blue fuzzy slippers and I see them under the door." and he got his interview with the person he meant to be. We all felt that in one way or another we were on the cutting edge of social research. We were designing new methods and producing results that were of some interest. So it was rather exciting for us, I think for all of us, in fact.
I worked with some very good people at the Bureau. And that was very stimulating. One of them was a man named Arthur Kornhauser. And Arthur was a good social psychologist, but he also had something that I had been missing, and that was a very strong sense of the ethics of research. We talked about it a lot, and he was very firm about the ethics of research, whereas I felt there was a lot of sloppiness going on around me, and that nobody did talk about the ethics of research. There are several experiences I had on coming face to face with this ethics thing. In Washington, everybody is looking for a job all the time. So every day somebody calls you up and says, Thelma, there's a job in the War Department that I think sounds like you. Why don't you go and see about it? So this was an Air Force job. And I thought, well, I'll go over and see what it's all about. And I went over and saw this very handsome young guy who said, no, there's nothing secret about this. We want to know how to do saturation bombing of Russian cities. So I was astonished, and we began discussing this, how you could do it and how you couldn't do it and so forth. And it wasn't until on my way back that I thought, I have just spent 40 minutes discussing saturation bombing of Russian cities. I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't do that. How could he be doing it? But I was just horrified that this was research being discussed very casually.
When the war ended, millions of men returned to civilian life and work, constricting professional opportunities for women. At Columbia, male sociology students took over research positions previously held by women. Joan Doris and Thelma Anderson both left the Bureau and joined Herta Herzog in the research department at the advertising giant McCann Erickson. Others, like Gladys Engel and Thelma McCormick, pursued graduate degrees in inhospitable environments dominated by men at every rank. Yole Granada worked in U.S.-occupied Japan.
When I went immediately after the war to be interviewed, I thought to be able to go to Italy, which is where I wanted to go. They told me, I'm sorry, but that particular operation has been terminated. And I was very disappointed, and they said, well, would you like to go to Japan instead? And I said, Japan? Yes! So off I went, and in Japan, my job was as information officer. There were the information office, which is the propaganda office of the United States government. That's what it really was. We have 4 or 5 people whose job it was to feed information and news of what was happening in the occupation to correspondents from all over. And I was one of 4 people dealing with the Allied press. We were, in a sense, censors. In order to get stories that went out, that would cover the occupation, the activities of the occupation, you had to have clearance. And in effect, MacArthur's office said, okay, you can broadcast this, or you can write this for the New York Times. My first assignment was to go to Ueno Station, which is the Grand Central of Japan, at night to check out stories that we had heard reported by orally that the people were dying of starvation. In the station at night, because it was warm and it was a place that people had no houses. They were bombed out. Tokyo was an absolute smash community, and I was assigned to do stories, which I found during the middle of the night. And I remember saying to myself as I walked to Ueno Station, "This is insane. I wouldn't be walking in the middle of the night to go to Grand Central. What am I doing here?" The status of women in Japan was abysmal. They had no power. It was a very traditional society. But I can tell you that a large part of the credit for what we did to push ahead reforms for women was due to the activities of a wonderful woman lieutenant, a WAC, an unglamorous, rather motherly looking young woman who single-handedly looked up as many groups of women that she could find out about who were surreptitiously feminists, got them all together and pushed ahead a fantastic number of reforms in the status of women under the occupation, which then became part of Japanese society.
There weren't many women who were working in the professional part. You know, there were lots of people who were in secretarial positions, and even some people who had college educations. They had a hard time getting anything better than kind of a high-grade secretarial positions. There really were not any scholarships or fellowships around, and the only fellowships that there was that I knew that I was eligible for was for the Social Science Research Council, and it was rather new in that time. In fact, I think that I was the first woman first or second woman who actually got one of these SSRC fellowships. And what happened was that I wrote up my proposal, what I wanted to do, and applied for it. But then somebody told the committee that I was pregnant. And the next thing I knew was that they were going to take the fellowship away, because I could not possibly, despite what I promised and said I would do, I could not really fulfill that fellowship because I would have a young baby at that time. But that was terrible. I mean, that was a shock that they did that. A lot of people have had things like that happen, but that was one that was really uncalled for. I think still in those days, women just simply were not expected to have these jobs. I mean, they were assistants to the men in the department, or they had some special relationship. And even though they were very able, they really didn't come into their own until in the 1970s, when there was a real breakthrough.
It was not a good place to be if you were a woman, and it was not a good place to be if you were young, I guess, because you hadn't established yourself and nobody was going to pay any attention to you. They just see right through you. Nobody's here.
They were very blind to the talents that women were bringing to the situation, and very uninterested in what talents you might have. Women did not have an easy time of it. They nevertheless persisted. And if you had 2 babies at home, we were just glad to have a job. So that there was prejudice, and it wasn't pleasant, and women talked about it, and they knew about it, but there was no discussion of women's liberation at all. No, those were very disturbing times, and no one took any of it for granted. It might be stimulating to you, but it was, underneath you knew that this was a very precarious environment. There were absolute jerks getting ahead, and we were being left behind.